Mark is a graduate of Lawrence in what state?
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin. When he graduated around 1969, he was awarded a fellowship, and he took that fellowship and earned a law degree at NYU. Later, earned his master's degree has made over 150 visits to the Middle East, and I don't think I've been to Elm Grove that many times. He has rubbed elbows with the likes of Anwar Sadat, Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat. He is the founder, I'm going to read this part, he is the founder and chairperson of the Jewish Committee on the Middle East, called JCOM, an organization of independent Jews, including professors at over 175 universities. This organization advocates a fully sovereign Palestinian state and calls for major changes in U.S. regional policy. Here we're talking about an American Jew who wants the Palestinians to have their own country. Mr. Bruzonsky currently hosts a half-hour TV program, Mideast Realities, which is shown weekly on all the cable systems in the Washington, D.C. area. I've been with him this morning, and he's a whirlwind. We've been to the talk radio show, and over to TV place in Ohio. And it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Mark Bruzonsky.
Mike, thank you very much, and Marilyn and Bob Grindley, thank you very much. Without you, I wouldn't be here. Good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
Turn the mic up.
You got to get right into that.
All right. Is that better? All right. Thank all of you for inviting me to Wheeling this afternoon, and thank you for coming to hear the remarks that I'm going to give you. I would prefer not to lecture to you. I'd rather speak to you and leave some time for questions and answers. But I'm also not going to be very entertaining. Unfortunately, the subject that I'm here to speak about is a very serious subject. I'll be only with you this one day.
Mark, we can't hear you.
All right, we're really going to have to put it right in front of me.
Can we turn it up a little bit? Or no?
Well, I don't know how to turn it up.
No, you're okay. Just try
Speak
it.
into it.
Okay, I'll put it right there. It's a very serious subject, and I guess I'm a very serious guy, so there aren't going to be very many entertaining remarks, and I hope you'll bear with me for the next 15 or 20 minutes, and then I hope there'll be some time for questions. Maybe this will also be a provocative day, because I say provocative because the differences between what most Americans have come to think about the Middle East, this is based on the limited and biased information that's available from the media, the misleading information that's given to us by our elected leaders, and frankly, the deceptive information that comes from various interest groups that want to propagandize all of us. The differences between all of this and the actual happenings in today's Middle East are very considerable. So rather than being entertaining, I hope I will be informative. As Mike said, I, to my surprise too, when I counted them up, have been to the region 150 times in the past 25 years since my student years. And let me make it clear from the outset, I'm not running for any office, I'm not raising any campaign contributions, I don't represent any lobbying organization, and thus I guess I'm free to tell you the truth as I see it without concern for whether or not you're going to think I'm a nice fellow at the end of this. Let me tell you about the peace process, which you hear all about all the time. It's called the Middle East Peace Process. The elected leaders tell us there's the Middle East Peace Process. We're all convinced by our TV news programs and by our newspapers that there is this peace process underway in the region. Well, when the peace process began, I was just out of school, and I did have the opportunity to meet Anwar Sadat privately. I did arrange for the first public telegram ever sent to Israel from the Arab world. That was back in 1977. In 78, there was the Camp David Accord. That was pretty much the beginning of the modern peace process. Well, Let's take a look at that peace process. Shortly after the peace process, there was the destruction of Lebanon. Tens of thousands of people, the entire country destroyed. There was the revolution in Iran, the American hostage crisis, the interference in our political affairs, the Iran-Contra scandal. Shortly after that, there was the beginning of the Intifada in Israel, the uprising. The Palestinian word, the Arabic word is Intifada. Too many of us have forgotten, or too many of us were never really told about a lot of these events. There was the Iran-Iraq war shortly after the Iranian Revolution. Quite literally, more than 1 million people were killed in a war that was fueled by the United States, by Israel, and by conservative Arab regimes. Then there was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Tens of thousands of people were killed. There was the horrendous massacre at Sabra and Shatila. There was the American intervention. There were American gunships pounding the hills over Beirut. There were American hostages. There was the Marine barracks blown up. There was the American embassy blown up. Americans left Lebanon. Then, of course, in the recent years, there was the war with Iraq. A war which you were told was started because Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The American people were not told many, many, many things. They were not told about the manipulation of oil prices by Kuwait at the instigation of Saudi Arabia and the United States. They were not told that Kuwait and Saudi Arabia had backed Iraq to attack Iran and that Iraq expected some paybacks for that. We were told about our American ambassador who went in to see the Iraqi president because there was a plot behind this war. If you think there were, many of you probably have never heard that expression. You've probably never heard that many experts consider the war with Iraq to have been a plot. And you've probably never heard this quote from Pierre Salinger. Hardly a radical personality, hardly a biased personality. In fact, Pierre Salinger was the White House spokesperson for John Kennedy, and he was the ABC bureau chief in Paris. So let me just give you an example of things you are not told, and yet things which have a tremendous bearing on what's happening in the region, American interests in the region, and our own lives, which I'll get to in a few moments. This is what Pierre Salinger has said in a talk that was not shown on American television. The Gulf War was the most interesting piece of reporting that I did because it came out with a story that the press didn't tell the American people, that the Gulf War was absolutely unnecessary. I mean, it was a plot. George Bush decided he wanted a war, and George Bush decided to tell Saddam Hussein to go ahead and invade Kuwait. Now, I could elaborate on why George Bush did this, but right now I'll just finish the quote. Back to Pierre Salinger. The interesting thing about that, about all of this, is that I've written it in a book that has been published in this country, except that not even 1% of the Americans even know that the book exists. And it's interesting because in Europe it sold millions of copies. And in the US it probably has sold about 25,000 copies. But it explains all the things that went on before the Gulf War took place, and it explains to what extent it was unnecessary for that war to take place. Back to the peace process, back to what we are all told is a process that is bringing peace and stability to the Middle East. In the war with Iraq, the Iraqis lost somewhere around 500,000 people. Their country was destroyed. One of the most progressive countries in the region was reduced to a country going back 40, 50 years in time. Since that time, over 500,000 children have died. These are not my figures, these are the UN figures. Over 500,000 Iraqi children have died, malnutrition, lack of medicine, starvation, because of the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq by the United States. Continuing with sort of an exploration of what the peace process means to the people of the Middle East. In Algeria, there's near revolution, when populist Islamic nationalist forces won democratic elections. The United States and conservative interests in the region encouraged a military government. A civil war has gone on. tremendous death and destruction, torture, abuse, total lack of human rights, total military government. The country remains in a civil war, and probably the government will not be able to hold the dike. There probably will be a nationalist Islamic government that will take over. In Sudan, there's been a revolution. Recently, the United States has withdrawn all of its diplomatic and business personnel from the country. We've had sanctions against Libya this entire time. What many people forgot is that the United States, with planes, attacked Libya, attempted to kill the leader of Libya, did kill relatives in his family, and that there's a lot of suspicion that the Pan Am 101 crisis was revenge by Libyans or others in the region for American policies. In Saudi Arabia, we have a totalitarian government, an extremely repressive government. Recently, the National Guard, which is the sort of Praetorian Guard of the Saudi royal family, supported by us, our tax dollars, our government. That building was blown up in a country that is pretty much a police state and monitored as closely as Saudi Arabia is. In Egypt, again, you have near revolution. You've had attacks by Islamic fundamentalist and nationalist forces for the last 4 or 5 years. There's been an attempt to assassinate Hosni Mubarak, both in this country and abroad when he was in Ethiopia. In occupied Palestine, you've seen the rise of Hamas, the rise of suicide bombers. There weren't any suicide bombers when I first started going to the Middle East, and there wasn't much violence or murder in the country of Egypt either. Things have changed tremendously. This is a reaction. It's not something that has just happened. It's a reaction to what's been taking place in the region, the policies that are being pursued by the country that has the greatest control over the region, which is, of course, our own country. In Kuwait, we know, of course, what's happened. The Emir of Kuwait has been put back on his throne pretty much by the American army. And in Bahrain, as we speak, a little country which houses American naval bases, there is revolution and panic quite literally as we speak. I got press reports before I left Washington yesterday that there's going to be a considerable attempt to portray what's happening in Bahrain as an Iranian-sponsored revolution. The purpose of portraying it that way is because if the Bahraini royal family is going to be pushed out, the perception in the region is that the American military is going to go to its defense. Right now, of course, the CIA is going to its defense, but we may actually be militarily intervening. Well, all in all, some peace process. For the people in the region, it's one conflict, one set of turmoils, one set of oppressive conditions, one set of client regimes, one set of American diplomatic and covert interventions that keep the region divided, that keep democracy the furthest thing from the region. American political leaders may speak of democracy, they may speak of human rights, but the realities in the region are exactly the opposite. We support the most repressive client regimes, the most repressive dictators. Saddam Hussein, by the way, was our pal for a period of years. We were working very closely with him. In fact, we were telling him that we wanted to have a closer relationship with him. That was April Glaspie's job in Baghdad, up until what happened with Kuwait. Well, you can rightly ask me, so what? We've got a lot of problems here at home. We've got a lot of problems. I'm sure you have problems here in Wheeling. I can tell you for sure we got lots of problems in Washington, D.C. Why should we all be so concerned about this? Well, that's a harder question than going through the litany of what's been going on in the region and why the peace process is a term but not a reality. Of course, there are issues of basic justice and human rights. We as Americans take a certain pride in being for justice, being for human rights, being for democracy. That in itself, the hypocrisy of American policies in the region, the duplicity of those policies should be enough of a reason in itself that we should be very concerned about what our country does in the Middle East. But there's also a cause and effect, and that cause and effect isn't felt necessarily from day to day. It's felt from year to year, sometimes from decade to decade. Let's take Iran, for instance, because many people may have forgotten or may never have known. In Iran, there was a revolution in 1953. It was a fairly liberal democratic revolution of intellectuals, of secular people. That revolution was undone by the CIA. It's in the history books. The CIA takes a great deal of credit for it. I have met people who were in that revolution, who were in the CIA and who undid that revolution. We put the Shah back on the throne. For the next 20 years, the Shah ran Iran, our strategic bastion at the time. He ran it with a terribly repressive hand, a terribly torturous hand, and by the time the revolution came about in the late 70s, the only forces left standing were the extremely radical, extremely anti-American, the forces of Ayatollah Khomeini. Those forces declared the United States the Great Satan, and after a generation of repression at the hands of the United States, they chose that particular slogan. Then we remember the hostage crisis, we remember the Iran-Contra situation, we remember that Jimmy Carter probably was defeated, at least to some extent, because of the foreign policy issues of that time. So these things come back to haunt us. Not to mention, look at the state of our capital. When I moved to Washington, right out of graduate school at Princeton, you could go down to the State Department, pull out your ID, they'd call upstairs, and if you had an appointment, up you went. Now, there are barricades all over the city. Pennsylvania Avenue's been closed. The Congress is a fortress. Our own country, even symbolically, has been turned from what it was to what it now is. We all know the situation in our airports. We all know the alerts that have been held. We all know about the World Trade Tower. And frankly, this is only the beginning. America's a very vulnerable country. Anybody with a little ingenuity who really wants to can do a lot more than's been done so far. And unfortunately, I predict that, in fact, that's the future that's coming. And it's the future that's coming because of the policies that we have had in the past, because of the policies we have at the moment. Now, I suspect what most of you have been expecting me to talk about is just the Arab-Israeli situation itself, Palestinian situation. The reason I've not started with that is because you have to see this in a regional context. What the United States does with Israel, what Israel does with the Palestinians, is not something unto itself. It's part of a larger regional policy that has mostly to do with oil, petrodollars, and wealth. That's really the subject for another day, but let me just summarize it in the following way. What's our real interest in the Middle East? We went to the Middle East after World War II. We went there to control the oil in the region. Our oil companies go into the major oil-producing countries. We pump whatever amounts of oil we want at concessionary prices. We pump oil at very low prices that is sent to this country, which artificially inflates our own standard of living and our own energy base. No country in the world has oil prices anywhere near the low levels that we have them. So that's why we support the regimes that are in power, and in return, these regimes let us come pump as much oil as we want, and then even the money we send them, which is considerable, is not used to develop their countries. It's not used for the welfare of the people of those countries. They don't have democratic systems, and they don't have Ross Perot, and they don't have people protesting. Instead, most of that money is squandered. The royal families give it to extended family members. It ends up in Swiss bank accounts. It ends up supporting lavish lifestyles. It ends up buying lots of American and British planes and arms and tanks. And it ends up being used to support one war or another, one group being played off against another. The figures that I've seen for the cost of the Gulf War to the Arab world are absolutely astronomical. $650 billion that would have been used to develop the country, that could have been used to develop the countries in the Middle East for the welfare of the people who live in the Middle East, ended up being used to finance the war. And what was the war about? The war was about putting the Emir of Kuwait back on his throne and keeping American control over the oil resources. All right, onto the Arab-Israeli issue because I've only got a few minutes, and I know that some of you will have to go back to your jobs soon, and so I'm going to summarize very much my views on the current peace process, and then I hope you will have some questions, and provocative questions if you feel that way. Under the name of peace process, and in the name of separation, and in the name of autonomy, the Palestinians are far worse off at the moment than they were before. In the name of separation, they are subjected to apartheid-like conditions. Now, of course, I could go into details, I could give examples, why the comparison with apartheid time doesn't permit, but there's one example after another. In the name of separation, Palestinians are being put on reservations, behind barbed wire fences, behind electrified fences, behind Israeli military checkpoints. This morning, in speaking with Mike and other people at radio station as well, I simply showed this map. You won't be able to see it too well, but the blue area, this is the West Bank. This is the area that the UN has said for 30 years has to be returned to the Palestinians. There's no Israeli land here. This is all across the Green Line. This is supposedly, according to the peace process we're all told, this is supposedly Palestinian-controlled now, or about to be Palestinian-controlled autonomously. However, the blue, everything you see in blue, is totally Israeli-controlled. No Palestinian control of any kind. And of the white, less than 10% of what you see of the white is actually controlled by Palestinians. The rest is all jointly controlled, which really means Israeli army controlled. Let me tell you what Professor Noam Chomsky has said led to this peace process, and then, with the permission of the chairman, I'll open it for questions. Professor Chomsky is on our advisory committee. He has been ever since 1987, when the Jewish Committee on the Middle East was formed. He's one of the best-known speakers and intellectuals at universities all around the world. He said that by 1993, Arafat was on the verge of being thrown out. The hatred and contempt for the PLO was extreme on the West Bank in those years. I remember that myself from wandering around West Bank villages and towns during the Intifada. People were saying, it's true, that's all we got, but they're really a bunch of corrupt jerks and we need to get rid of them. By 1993, this was reaching a real flood, and there were open calls for throwing Arafat and his clique of gangsters out. At that point, apparently he realized, and certainly the Israelis realized, that this would be a good time to make an agreement with the PLO, the shadow of its former self, because now, to save a fragment of his former authority and power, he'll be our agent, kind of like the local Indian mercenaries in India who ran the place, or the Salvadoran military. And that's what happens. That's the real peace process. Well, I've got more. I've got a list of quotes that are more shocking than this one. This should really concern all of us because there's something deeper and more all-encompassing that we all have to live with. It's the corruption of our political process, the corruption of our institutions. I live in Washington. All of us know in Washington that Bill Clinton was helped to gain his job by the Israeli Jewish lobby. We have tapes of people heading that lobby, the president of that lobby, bragging that we've infiltrated his campaign. We have a dozen operatives in Little Rock. When he's elected president, he's going to do what we want him to do. We all know that our political system is corrupted by lobbying interests, and we all know that our press is substantially pressured, like our politicians are, when people get out of line, when people speak up, when people acknowledge things that in public that they're not supposed to acknowledge. People like Pierre Salinger can't get his book sold in the United States because of what is in the books. So again, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for letting me be so serious. I think I do understand the Middle East reasonably well. I'm not very good at telling jokes, especially on this subject. But I appreciate that you've been attentive, and if time permits, I'd be more than glad to take whatever questions you might have.